Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today I want to dive into a provocative headline that's been floating around. When Beyoncé copyright started praising him, he knew something was wrong. It's a striking statement, and as with many viral tropes, it can serve as a metaphor or a lens to examine deeper power dynamics, celebrity influence, and geopolitical tensions. We'll use that as our narrative hook, but our real journey is through the latest high-stakes developments in Africa and the United States and what it tells us about global influence, morality, and brinkmanship. So buckle in. Over the next stretch, we'll walk through what's happening in Africa today, then shift to what's shaking in the United States, and finally compare both arenas to draw lessons and warnings. In the end, we'll ask, when praise comes from unexpected quarters, is it validation or a signal of something deeper, perhaps something wrong? Let's begin in Africa. Picture this: a continent of 54 sovereign nations, each with its own struggles and potential. In 2025, Africa is not just a backwater in global politics, it's a contested zone of influence, development, and often turmoil. From trade wars to civil unrest, the headlines are full of tension. Let me walk you through several threads that stand out. One of the biggest recent shocks: the expiry of AGOA, the African Growth and Opportunity Act, a U.S. trade initiative that for decades allowed many sub-Saharan African countries duty-free access to the U.S. market. That program has now lapsed, and the consequences are already visible. Hundreds of thousands of jobs, particularly in textile and apparel sectors, are at risk. For many economies that depended on export access to the United States, sudden tariffs reintroduced are a blow. Take South Africa. Washington slapped a 30% tariff on its exports, effectively neutralizing the remaining benefit of AGOA for one of Africa's most advanced economies. South African officials have rushed to negotiate, sending delegations to Washington. But trust isn't easy to rebuild. The relationship between the US and South Africa is, by many accounts, on the brink of collapse. Beyond trade, the US is now offering asylum under a white South African refugee program, specifically targeting Afrikaners, citing claims of persecution in South Africa's land reform process. Pretoria strongly rejects the claim and views it as a racially tinged intervention. At the same time, Africa is wrestling with internal crises. In the Democratic Republic of the Congo, DRC, protests erupted in the capital Kinshasa in January over the advance of the M23 rebel group and perceived interference from neighboring Rwanda. Several embassies, including the US Embassy, were targeted in the unrest. The anger was explicit: demands for international actors to do more, to re-evaluate alliances, and to pay attention to African agency. But there is a paradoxical shift too. The United States has increasingly played a role as mediator in African conflicts. Take the 2025 peace agreement between the DRC and Rwanda, signed in Washington, D.C. The accord called for Rwandan troop withdrawal from parts of eastern DRC, disarmament, and a regional economic integration framework. The USA, with its fingerprints now on African diplomacy, wants to recast itself not just as a partner but as an arbiter. Some African leaders are wary. Mediation that looks like influence can carry strings. The security dimension is also urgent. Terror networks in the Sahel, especially in Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso, are booming. The top US General for Africa, Michael Langley, warned that Islamist groups affiliated with ISIS and Al-Qaeda are gaining ground, expanding toward coastal routes, and potentially threatening the homeland. But US withdrawal from bases, for example Niger, who cancelled a long-standing security pact, has complicated oversight and presence. Meanwhile, protests are erupting in resource-rich but inequality-poor states. Angola, despite being a major oil producer, saw a wave of demonstrations after the government removed fuel subsidies. Thousands took to the streets. Clashes with security forces led to deaths and widespread arrests. In Mali, what began as a putsch regime is now being challenged by mass protests against extended rule, dissolution of political parties, and the repression of dissent. Africa's challenges now include legitimacy, governance crisis, and the difficulty of bridging resource wealth with public benefit. Now, here's where the Beyoncé copyright metaphor enters. Recall that news item from May 2025. AI-generated music videos circulated praising Burkina Faso's junta leader Ibrahim Traoré copyright, attributing glowing tributes to Beyoncé copyright, R. Kelly, and others. Whether or not Beyoncé copyright had any role, the viral content used her brand and aura to legitimize a military ruler. That artifice of a star's praise becomes a tool of propaganda. The message, if even Beyoncé copyright is praising him, he must be worth respecting. But that praise is hollow and manufactured. It becomes more sinister when it is manipulated, weaponized. So, when Beyoncé copyright starts praising him, the real answer is that someone is using a veneer of cultural legitimacy to cover a deeper problem: a dictatorship, propaganda, or creeping authoritarianism. Next, let's shift across the Atlantic and peer into the United States. The US in 2025 is undergoing its own convulsions: political polarization, institutional crises, shifting global posture. Let's unpack. First, the US government shutdown and Congress dysfunction. The legislative body has repeatedly failed to pass appropriations, leaving essential programs on hold, and sowing uncertainty domestically and abroad. The fallout ripples through markets, foreign aid, defense commitments, and the entire architecture of American power. For example, markets are watching even the South African rand, anticipating US developments around a GOA renewal. Second, the re-emergence of protectionism and trade retrenchment. The US under Trump is reviving a posture of America first, prioritizing tariffs, reciprocal trade demands, and aggressive negotiation stances. That's exactly what we see in its posture toward Africa: less aid, more transactional demands. Major US development initiatives such as USAID and the Millennium Challenge Corporation face cuts or dismantling under the new regime. Third, the refugee and asylum strategy is increasingly racialized. The US is proposing to cut refugee quotas dramatically, perhaps as low as 7,500 people per year, and allocating a disproportionate number to white South Africans. This is a bold move that ties immigration, race, and foreign policy together in a provocative way. Fourth, foreign policy is reoriented. The US wants to pivot away from long-term aid commitments and towards strategic bargains, especially in Africa. Massat Bellows, a new senior advisor for Africa, emphasizes peace, partnerships, and prosperity, but insists on reciprocity, not just aid. The US is trying to rebrand itself as an economic power broker, but the credibility gap is wide. There's also a symbolic dimension. The US is mediating the DRC-Rwanda peace accord, positioning itself as indispensable in African affairs. But at the same time, it is undermining its own moral standing through domestic dysfunction, racialized asylum policies, and perceived hypocrisy. The US wants to be the judge, but it's also the accused in many narratives. Then there's the domestic unrest and polarization, debates over civil rights, voting rights, infrastructure, public sector strikes, and the legitimacy of institutions. The US is not immune to instability, especially if faith in governance continues to erode. Now, let's compare Africa and the US through the lens of our metaphor. When external praise or legitimacy is used, what is being hidden? What structures are reinforcing power? First, both theaters are dealing with legitimacy, influence, and narrative control. In Africa, leaders, or forces, are keenly aware of the optics. Being praised by a global cultural icon or having such praise facade can bolster their narrative. In the US, political factions seek validation from media, elites, or elite opinions to justify controversial actions. Praise, even grudging or cautious praise, can become a shield. Second, the global balance is shifting. Africa is no longer a passive subject of US policy. Many nations are diversifying partners: China, Russia. Intra-African trade. When the American trade umbrella pulls back, African states scramble to reorient. The US, meanwhile, is attempting to reassert relevance via tactical diplomacy, trade threats, and targeted policies. Third, both places show the fragility of institutional trust. In Africa, weak institutions struggle under protests, coups, and economic stress. In the US, institutions are strained by polarization, shutdowns, and internal conflicts. When praise or legitimacy fails to compensate for structural weakness, cracks appear. Fourth, the role of propaganda, media, and perception is central. Whether AI-generated videos that invoke Beyoncé copyright's name or US media outlets shaping narratives at home, both continents are wrestling with truth versus spectacle. In both places, admiration is leveraged whether honestly or manipulatively to mask underlying decay. Fifth, the ethics of praise from controversial figures is tricky. Would you trust praise from someone beholden to your oppressors? When praise becomes transactional, it ceases to be genuine. That's the core danger, using cultural legitimacy to sanitize or whitewash deeper dysfunction. Let's bring this home with a strong conclusion. In the headline, when Beyoncé copyright started praising him, he knew something was wrong. The literal claim is absurd. Why would the endorsement of a pop star alone mark an ethical inflection point? But as a metaphor, it's powerful. It signals that when legitimacy is weaponized, when soft power is used to mask hard failures, we should be on guard. Praise, especially unexpected praise, can mask coercion, compromise, or complicity. It can be manufactured as a tool, not granted as acknowledgement. In Africa, we see this in manipulated cultural messaging, AI videos praising military juntas, strategic diplomacy overlain with legitimation, and trade relationships held hostage by optics. In the US, we see it in the interplay of media, approval, policy, race, and identity. The one praising might not be the hero. Sometimes the praise itself is the cloak. As viewers, as citizens, as global participants, our role is not just to consume the headlines, but to decode them. We must ask, who stands to benefit from this praise? Who is controlling the narrative? What truths are being hidden? And what structural cracks are being papered over?